They told me my husband would get me killed. They said it at my wedding, in whispers they thought I could not hear. They said it in the council halls, in the training yards, in the quiet corners of every social gathering I attended for the next 6 years. A Kaylori fleet commander, bonded to a human, not just any human either, not a soldier, not a diplomat, not even someone with a notable family name or political value, an agricultural engineer named Ethan Cole, who stood 5 feet and 10 inches tall, weighed less than a Kaylori adolescent, and smiled at everyone he met as if the universe had never once given him a reason not to. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am not telling you this story to make you feel sorry for him. I am not telling you this story to make you feel sorry for me. I am telling you this story because 3 galactic intelligence agencies have now classified my husband as a strategic-level threat, and I need you to understand how a man who talks to his tomato plants and cannot open a jar without asking for help became the single most feared organism on Kalon Prime. It started, as most things do, with love. And love, as I have learned, is the most dangerous force in the known galaxy. I met Ethan through the Interspecies Cultural Exchange Program. I was assigned as a military liaison. He was assigned as a soil specialist, sent to study Kaylori agricultural methods and share human techniques for growing food in difficult terrain. He arrived on our world carrying a single bag, a box of earth seeds, and a smile so wide and so warm that 3 members of my security detail privately asked me if humans used facial expressions as a form of psychological attack. He was not what I expected. Kaylori stand between 7 and 9 feet tall. We have 4 arms, dense scales that can deflect low-caliber rounds, and a skeletal structure reinforced with natural carbide deposits. Our children begin combat training at the age of 4. Our language has 47 words for different types of fighting, and only 3 for love, 2 of which are considered outdated. We are, by every galactic metric, one of the most formidable species in known space. Ethan Cole looked at all of this, looked at me standing a full 2 feet above him in ceremonial armor, and said, "Hi, I brought seeds. Do you have somewhere I could plant them?" I should have known then. I should have seen it. But I did not, because I was looking at him the way my people always look at humans. I was looking at the outside. Over the following months, I watched him work. He knelt in Kaylori soil that our own agricultural scientists had declared barren, and somehow, through patience and bizarre human techniques involving composted waste and careful mineral adjustments, coaxed green shoots from red rock. He worked from sunrise to sunset. He never complained about the gravity, which was 40% stronger than what his body was designed for. He never complained about the heat, or the dust, or the fact that every piece of equipment in the facility was built for beings with 4 arms and twice his reach. He simply adapted, quietly, without announcement. I fell in love with him on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because he had been tracking local growing cycles and had named the days of the week after Earth days to keep himself oriented, and he told me it was Tuesday when he offered me a small red fruit he had grown from earth seeds in Kaylori soil. A tomato, he called it. It was warm from the sun and slightly imperfect, and he held it out to me like it was a diamond. I ate it. It was the most extraordinary thing I had ever tasted. Our courtship was quiet. Our wedding was not. Kaylori bonding ceremonies, our public declarations witnessed by clan elders, military peers, and extended family networks. Mine was attended by 212 Kaylori, most of them decorated warriors, and 1 human who wore a borrowed ceremonial sash that kept sliding off his narrow shoulders. He had memorized a traditional Kaylori bonding poem and recited it in front of everyone. His accent was terrible. He mispronounced at least 4 words. He mixed up the word for eternal with the word for slightly damp. Half the room winced. A few covered their faces. I thought it was the bravest thing I had ever witnessed, and I had boarded burning warships. The whispers began before the ceremony ended. Her pet, the soft one, has the commander lost her mind? I heard them. I heard every single one. And here is the part of this story that shames me most. Part of me agreed, not with the cruelty, but with the assessment. I looked at Ethan standing there, small and fragile, and beaming with happiness, and some dark, trained part of my warrior brain whispered, "They are right. He is weak, and you have chosen weakness. I carried that thought like a blade hidden in my chest for years. I loved him. I loved him with a depth that frightened me. But I could not shake the feeling that I had made a choice my people would never forgive, and that the universe would eventually punish. We settled in a compound on the outskirts of my ancestral territory. Ethan converted half the courtyard into a garden within the first month. He rigged an irrigation system using parts he scavenged from a decommissioned military transport. He planted earth vegetables alongside Kaylori root crops, and somehow made them grow together in soil that should have rejected at least half of them. He cooked every meal. He had learned traditional Kaylori recipes, and then, without asking permission, added human spices and techniques that made them taste better. I never told him this. I ate his food in silence and pretended the improvement was minor. Our neighbors were retired Kaylori veterans, hardened warriors who had served in campaigns across 3-star systems. They watched Ethan from their balconies with expressions that cycled between pity and confusion. Here was this small creature, humming to himself, talking to his plants, carrying irrigation tanks that should have been too heavy for his frame, and doing it all with a cheerfulness that seemed almost aggressive in its persistence. They did not understand him. Neither did I. Not yet. The first real test came 6 months after our bonding, when my cousin Draven visited. Draven was everything the Kaylori valued. 9 feet tall, 4 arms thick with muscle, scarred from 12 campaigns, decorated with more combat honors than anyone in our generation. He arrived at our compound in full ceremonial armor, and looked at Ethan the way one might look at a piece of furniture that had been placed in the wrong room. Dinner was painful. Draven tested Ethan's grip strength by offering a traditional warrior's clasp, a 4-armed handshake that Ethan could only answer with 2 hands, and a fraction of the required pressure. Draven asked about his combat training. Ethan said he had none. Draven asked about his military service. Ethan said he had never served. Draven asked, in a tone that was barely disguised contempt, whether Valeth kept him as a comfort companion rather than a true mate. The table went silent. I waited for Ethan to react, to bristle, to defend himself, to show even a flicker of the defensive anger that any Kaylori male would have displayed at such a direct insult. He did not. He refilled Draven's glass. He asked about Draven's deployments with what appeared to be genuine interest. He listened. He asked follow-up questions. He complimented the craftsmanship of Draven's armor. Draven left that evening looking more unsettled than I had ever seen him. Not angry, not satisfied, unsettled, as if something about the interaction had not followed the script he expected. After Draven left, I turned on Ethan. I was furious. Though now I understand the fury was misdirected. I asked him why he did not defend himself, why he sat there and absorbed every insult like it was nothing, why he let my cousin treat him like something less than a person. Ethan put down the dishes he was clearing. He looked at me with those calm brown eyes and said, "He wasn't trying to hurt me, Vale. He was trying to understand why you chose me, and honestly, I wonder that sometimes too." I had no answer for that. I stood in my own kitchen, 2 feet taller than my husband, 4 times stronger, trained in 11 forms of combat, and I had absolutely no idea what to say. Because the truth was, in that moment, I felt smaller than he was. He had absorbed an evening of humiliation without losing a single degree of warmth, and I could not even handle a question about my own choices. I went to bed that night with a weight in my chest that I could not name. I loved him. I loved him desperately. But I was afraid, deep down in the quiet part of myself that I never showed anyone, that my people were right, that I had married something fragile, that the universe would come for him, and I would not be able to stop it, and I would be left standing in the wreckage wondering why I had chosen a man made of glass in a world made of iron. I was wrong about all of it, but it would take something terrible to teach me that. The first time I realized I had misjudged my husband was not a dramatic moment. It was small, so small that I almost missed it, and I think about that sometimes. I think about how many other small moments I missed because I was too busy looking for the wrong kind of strength. It happened on an ordinary morning, 3 years into our bonding. Our neighbor Vorath's daughter, a young Kaylori girl named Tessa, fell from a training wall in the adjacent compound. She was 8 years old and had been practicing climbing drills, which Kaylori children begin at age 6. She fell badly. 2 of her 4 arms broke on impact, and the sound of her screaming carried across the courtyard and through our walls. I reacted the way any Kalori would. I assessed. The fall was not life-threatening. The compound had medical facilities. Vorath and his mate were present. I began calculating whether I needed to intervene or whether standard protocols would be sufficient. This is how my people handle emergencies. We evaluate. We calculate. We respond with measured efficiency. Ethan did not calculate. Ethan heard a child screaming, and he ran. He was out of our compound before I had finished my assessment, barefoot, still wearing his gardening clothes. He crossed the shared courtyard at a full sprint, which on a world with 40% more gravity than his body was built for, was an act of physical effort that I did not appreciate at the time. He reached Tessa before her own parents had moved from the assessment phase to the response phase. I followed him to the doorway and watched. What I saw changed something inside me, though I did not fully understand what until much later. Ethan knelt beside Tessa. He took her two unbroken hands in his and held them. He positioned his face directly in her line of sight and spoke to her in a low, steady voice. He did not tell her to stop crying. He did not tell her to be brave. He did not tell her to endure, which is what any Kalori adult would have said. He told her she was going to be fine. He told her the pain was temporary. He told her a story about a time he fell out of a tree as a child and broke his own arm, and how scared he was, and how it healed, and how the tree was still there the last time he checked. While he talked, his hands were moving. He had grabbed 2 straight stakes from the garden and strips of fabric from his own shirt, and he fashioned a splint for both broken arms with a speed and confidence that spoke of practice. Not medical training, he told me later, just a childhood spent in rural places where the nearest doctor was sometimes far away, and you learned to manage until help arrived. Tessa stopped screaming. She was crying, but the screaming stopped, because she was focused on the strange little alien creature kneeling in front of her who was holding her hands and telling her about a tree on a planet she had never seen. Vorath and his mate stood watching. They did not intervene. Later, Vorath told me it was because he did not know what to do with what he was seeing. In his entire life, he had never witnessed an adult male respond to a child's injury with that kind of immediate, physical, emotional engagement. It was outside his framework. Outside every Kalori framework. We are taught to assess first, act second, comfort never. Comfort is considered a civilian function, below the dignity of a warrior household. Ethan Cole did not care about dignity. He cared about a screaming child. After the medics arrived and Tessa was taken for treatment, I stood in the courtyard with Ethan. His shirt was torn from where he had ripped strips for the splint. His feet were cut from running barefoot across rough Kalori stonework. He was breathing hard from the exertion of sprinting in heavy gravity. He did not seem to notice any of this. He asked me if I thought Tessa would be all right. He asked if the medical facilities on Kalon Prime were equipped for pediatric bone repair. He asked if I could check on her later. He never once mentioned his own discomfort. He never once mentioned that he had just run full speed across an alien compound in bare feet. He never once mentioned the fact that he had responded faster and with more effectiveness than trained Kalori warriors who outweighed him by 300 pounds. I began watching him more carefully after that, not with suspicion, but with a kind of bewildered attention, like someone who has been looking at a painting from the wrong angle for years and has suddenly shifted position and sees something entirely different. I noticed things I had previously dismissed. The irrigation tanks he carried every morning weighed 90 kilograms each. On Earth, that would have been a moderate effort for a fit human. On Kalon Prime, with the increased gravity, each tank effectively weighed 126 kilograms. He carried 2 of them, every morning, without complaint, without augmentation, without asking for help. He had been doing this for 3 years, and his body had adapted in ways that were invisible to the casual observer, but, once I started looking, were remarkable. His shoulders had thickened, his legs had developed the dense, compact musculature of someone who had been living under constant physical resistance. He moved differently than the human who had arrived on Kalon Prime 6 years ago. He moved like someone who had been quietly, patiently, building himself into something that could survive here. The tools were another revelation. Every piece of equipment in our compound was designed for Kalori physiology. Forearmed grips, scaled hand interfaces, weight ratings based on calorie strength minimums. Ethan could not use any of them as designed, so he modified them. Every single one. He rebuilt handles, reweighted balance points, created adapter grips, and engineered workarounds that allowed him to operate four-armed machinery with two hands. He had done this silently, without telling me, without asking for assistance, without filing a single complaint about the fact that our entire civilization's infrastructure was designed to exclude him. He had also learned our language far more deeply than I realized. Not just the common tongue, which most off-worlders could manage with translation assistance, but the market dialect, the trade tongue used in commercial districts, and enough of the military command language to follow news broadcasts and council proceedings. He listened to the news every evening while he cooked. I had assumed he was listening to the music that played between segments. He was not. He was tracking political developments. One evening, after I had spent the day reviewing old mission reports and feeling the familiar weight of my diminished status in Kalori society, I asked Ethan something I had never asked before. I asked him about his life on Earth, not the professional history I had read in his exchange program file. His actual life, his childhood, the things that had made him who he was. He was quiet for a long time. He turned down the heat on whatever he was cooking and leaned against the counter and looked at a point somewhere past my shoulder, and then he told me. His parents had died when he was 7. A transport accident on a highway in a region of Earth called the Midwest. He was raised by an uncle who was not kind. He did not elaborate on this, and I did not press. But the way he said, "not kind," carried a weight that made my chest hurt. He put himself through education. He worked multiple jobs simultaneously while studying. He chose agricultural engineering because, in his words, I wanted to make things grow in places where things shouldn't be able to grow. He said all of this simply, without self-pity, without using his pain as leverage or armor or currency. He stated facts the way one might describe the weather, and then he went back to cooking. I sat with that for a long time. In Kalori culture, suffering is a badge. We display our scars. We recount our battles. We measure each other by the pain we have endured and survived. It is our most fundamental social currency. Ethan had endured more than most Kalori I knew, and he had never once mentioned it. Not to gain sympathy, not to gain status, not to excuse his own behavior, or demand special treatment. He had simply carried it, quietly, for his entire life, and used it as fuel to build something good. I asked him why he had never told me any of this before. He smiled, and it was not his usual bright smile. It was smaller, older, and it did not quite reach his eyes. "You never asked," he said, "and it's not the kind of thing you put on a resume." That night, I lay awake in our sleeping chamber and listened to him breathe beside me, and tried to reconcile what I knew with what I had believed. I had married a man I thought was soft. I was beginning to understand that what I had mistaken for softness was something else entirely. Something my language did not have a word for. Something that looked like gentleness from the outside but was, at its core, a form of strength so different from anything the Kalori had ever encountered that we simply did not have the framework to recognize it. Humans have an expression, "Still waters run deep." I had married an ocean and spent 6 years mistaking it for a pond. Meanwhile, the world outside our garden walls was changing. The news broadcasts Ethan listened to every evening were growing darker. A political movement called the Vaynar Ascendancy had been gaining influence in the outer territories for several years, but in recent months, their rhetoric had sharpened. They were Kalori supremacists, a faction that believed our species had been weakened by integration with alien cultures, and that the presence of non-Kalori residents on our homeworld was a contamination that needed to be purged. They had seats on regional councils now. They had supporters in the military. They held rallies that drew thousands. I dismissed them. Every established Kalori institution dismissed them. They were fringe. They were loud, but ultimately powerless. They would burn themselves out, as extremist movements always did. Ethan did not dismiss them. He listened to their speeches with a focused attention that I found odd at the time. He began reinforcing the garden walls. When I asked why, he said the soil needed better wind protection. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was admitting that my gentle human husband was preparing for something that I, a decorated fleet commander had failed to see coming. I should have listened. I should have looked at the situation through his eyes instead of mine. Because Ethan Cole did not come from a species that had ruled unchallenged for 10,000 years. He came from a species that had survived ice ages, plagues, and the constant, grinding reality that the universe does not care whether you live or die. Humans do not have the luxury of dismissing threats. They have learned, through millennia of painful experience, that the things that destroy you are always the things you assumed were too small to matter. He saw what was coming. He tried to tell me in his quiet way, and I, in my arrogance, did not listen. I am a Kalori fleet commander. I have fought in 11 campaigns across 4 star systems. I have boarded warships while they burned. I have walked through plasma fire. I have held the line against species that the rest of the galaxy considers nightmares given flesh. I have done things that would break most beings, and I have done them without flinching, because that is what I was born and trained and built to do. I tell you now, with absolute honesty, that I have never been as frightened as I was the night they came for my family. It was the deep part of the night cycle, the hour when Kalon Prime's twin moons sit at their lowest point, and the light drops to almost nothing. Ethan was asleep beside me. His breathing was slow and even. He always slept deeply. I used to watch him sometimes, and marvel at how completely he surrendered to unconsciousness. Kalori sleep lightly, always half alert, a biological remnant of our predator ancestry. Ethan slept like a creature that had decided to trust the universe entirely for 8 hours at a time. I found it both endearing and mildly terrifying. The first thing I heard was nothing. That is not a contradiction. I heard the absence of something, the low-frequency hum of our compound's security grid, which ran constantly, and which I had long since stopped consciously noticing. It stopped. In the silence that followed, a cold awareness flooded through me. Security grids do not simply stop, they are deactivated. I reached for the weapon I kept beneath the sleeping platform. My hand closed on empty air. It was gone. Someone had entered our chamber while we slept and removed it. Before I could move, before I could even turn to wake Ethan, the room filled with light and sound. A concussive blast hit me in the chest, and I recognized it immediately. A neural suppressor, military grade, tuned to Kalori physiology. It scrambled the signals between my brain and my muscles, and I collapsed. I did not lose consciousness. I lost control. I could see. I could hear. I could not move. I could not speak. I lay on the floor of my own sleeping chamber, paralyzed, and watched through eyes I could not close, as 8 figures in dark tactical armor moved through our home. They were Kalori, all of them. I could tell by the way they moved, the precise 4-armed coordination of trained soldiers operating in formation. They wore no unit markings. Their armor was unmarked matte black, but the discipline was unmistakable. These were not random extremists. These were professionals. Their leader entered last. She was tall, even by Kalori standards, and she moved with the particular fluid grace of someone who had spent decades in close combat and had long since stopped thinking about the mechanics. She removed her helmet, and I saw a face marked with deep scars, pale blue scales, and eyes the color of frozen methane. I did not recognize her, but I recognized the emblem she wore on a chain around her neck, the broken circle, the symbol of the Vaynar ascendancy. She crouched beside me. She did not rush. She had the calm confidence of someone who believed the situation was entirely under control. "Commander Valith Soran," she said. Her voice was smooth and almost pleasant. "My name is Korvan. I wish we were meeting under different circumstances, but you have made your choices, and now those choices have consequences." I tried to speak. The neural suppressor turned my words into a shapeless groan. "Do not strain yourself," Korvan said. "The suppressor will wear off in approximately 4 hours. By then, this will be over." She stood and looked around our sleeping chamber, at the human touches Ethan had added over the years, the photographs of Earth landscapes, the small shelf of physical books, the ridiculous handmade curtains he had sewn because he said our windows looked bare. Korvan looked at all of it with an expression of clinical disgust. "You could have been great, Commander," she said. "You were great. And then you brought this creature into our world, into a Kalori bloodline, and you diminished everything your ancestors built. Tonight, we correct that error. I heard sounds from outside the sleeping chamber. Movement, a scuffle, something breaking. Then voices, rough and commanding, and beneath them, a sound that stopped my heart. Ethan's voice. Not screaming, not pleading, just a single, sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone absorbing a blow and choosing not to cry out. 2 soldiers dragged him into the chamber. They had pulled him from the garden, I realized. He had not been in bed beside me. He had been outside, and the question of why he had been in the garden in the middle of the night cycle would not occur to me until much later, when the answer would make perfect, terrible sense. They dropped him on the floor in front of Korvan. His lip was split. His left eye was swelling shut. His hands were bound behind his back with magnetic restraints. He was wearing his garden clothes, dirt still on his knees, and he looked so small in that room full of armored Kalori that something inside me cracked. But he was not panicking. That was the first thing I noticed. Humans, I had been told, were prey animals at their core. When cornered, they froze, or they fled, or they broke. Ethan was not doing any of these things. He was kneeling on the floor, bleeding from his face, surrounded by 8 beings who could each kill him with a single blow. And he was breathing, slowly, deliberately, in through the nose, out through the mouth, a controlled rhythm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with focus. I had seen that breathing pattern before. In soldiers, moments before combat. Korvan circled him. She studied him the way a scientist might study a specimen, with detached curiosity and no respect. So this is the human, she said. This is what a Kalori commander sacrificed her honor for. She reached down and gripped his chin with one hand, turning his face left and right. Fragile, soft-skinned, small. I confess I expected something more. Ethan said nothing. His eyes tracked Korvan's movements with a stillness that, if I had not been paralyzed and terrified, I might have recognized as tactical assessment. Korvan released his face and straightened. Here is what will happen, Commander, she said, addressing me but watching Ethan. Your human will be taken from this compound. He will be transported to the capital. He will be displayed publicly as an example of what happens when Kalori bloodlines are contaminated by alien influence. And then he will be removed, permanently. The ascendancy is cleansing Kalon Prime. Your pet is simply the most prominent symbol of the disease. I screamed inside my own skull. I threw every ounce of willpower I had against the neural suppressor, trying to force my muscles to respond, trying to reach for Ethan, trying to do anything at all. My body did not move. I was trapped inside myself, watching the person I loved most being sentenced in front of me, and I could not lift a single finger. Then something happened that none of us expected. A sound came from the garden, a small, frightened whimper, the kind of sound a child makes when they wake up in an unfamiliar place and realize they are not safe. One of Korvan's soldiers moved to investigate. He returned 30 seconds later, dragging a small figure by the arm. It was Tessa, Vorath's daughter, the child Ethan had helped months ago, the one whose broken arms he had splinted with garden stakes and strips of his own shirt. She had been sneaking into our garden at night. I did not know this. Later, I would learn that she had been doing it for weeks, climbing over the compound wall after her parents fell asleep, and curling up among Ethan's plants because she felt safe there. Because the strange little human who had held her hands and told her about a tree on a faraway planet had become the only adult in her life who made her feel protected. She was 8 years old, she was trembling, and she was standing in a room full of armed extremists who had just declared their intention to purge non-Kalori influence from the planet. Korvan looked at the child. She looked at her soldiers. She made a calculation, and I watched her make it, and I knew what she was going to do before she did it, because I had spent my career studying tactical decision-making, and I recognized the cold logic of someone who has decided that collateral utility outweighs collateral cost. Korvan grabbed Tessa. She pulled the child against her chest and placed a blade against the soft scales of her throat. Not to harm her, to control the room. The child was leverage, against Vorath, against the neighborhood, against anyone who might interfere. Unfortunate, Korvan said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but. But perhaps useful, one more reason for the good citizens of this district to cooperate with the transition. I watched Ethan's face. I have replayed this moment in my memory more times than I can count. I have described it to military psychologists, to intelligence analysts, to the Kaylori High Council itself. And every time I describe it, I use the same words, because there are no better ones. Something left his eyes, the warmth, the gentleness, the open, trusting kindness that I had looked at every day for 6 years and mistaken for weakness. It drained out of his face like water through sand, and what remained was something I had never seen before. Not in anyone. It was not rage. It was not fear. It was not the cold calculation of a Kaylori warrior. It was something else entirely. Something my language does not have a word for, because my species has never needed one. Every trace of the man who talked to his plants, and hummed while he cooked, and smiled at strangers, and could not open a jar without help, vanished. And in his place, kneeling on the floor of our sleeping chamber with his hands bound and his face bleeding, was something that made every Kaylori in that room take an unconscious half-step backward, without understanding why. Ethan looked at Corvan. He looked at the blade against Tessa's throat, and when he spoke, his voice was different. Low, flat, stripped of every soft thing that usually lived in it, a voice I had never heard from him, a voice that sounded like a door closing. "Put the child down," he said. "You have 3 seconds. After that, I stop asking." Corvan laughed. Her soldiers laughed. Of course they laughed. He was a human. He was unarmed. He was bound. He was bleeding. He was smaller than every person in the room. He was, by every measurable standard, the least threatening being present. 3 seconds, Corvan repeated, amused. "And then what, human?" Ethan did not answer. He counted. His voice was perfectly steady. No tremor, no hesitation. Each number falling like a stone into still water. 1, Corvan smirked. 2. One of the soldiers shifted his weight. Not a conscious movement, an instinct. The kind of instinct that tells a body something is wrong, even when the mind has not caught up yet. 3. On Earth, there is an ancient concept. I learned about it later, from human military researchers who were brought in to analyze what happened that night. They called it protective aggression. It is not rage. It is not madness. It is not adrenaline, though adrenaline is part of it. It is a calculated, biological override that activates when a human being believes, with absolute certainty, that someone they love is about to be harmed. It suppresses pain. It suppresses fear. It suppresses self-preservation. It reallocates every resource the human body possesses toward a single objective, not survival, protection. Every other species in the galaxy fights to survive. Humans fight to protect. And until that night, I did not understand the difference. I was about to learn. 8 Kaylori elite soldiers, armed, armored, trained since childhood, and 1 human agricultural engineer with a split lip and no weapon. What happened next is now filed under the highest classification level the Kaylori High Council has ever assigned to a single domestic incident. I know this because I am the one who filed the report, and I am the one who watched them read it, and I am the one who saw the expressions on their faces when they finished. I am going to tell you what happened anyway, because the galaxy needs to understand what a human becomes when you threaten the people they love. 3. The count ended, and Ethan moved. Not the way Kaylori move. We are built for power. Our muscles generate enormous force. Our 4 arms provide leverage and reach. And our combat techniques are designed around overwhelming opponents through superior physical capability. Ethan could not do any of that. He did something different. Something that the Kaylori soldiers in that room were entirely unprepared for, because their training had never accounted for it. He was fast. Not fast in the way that a Kaylori warrior is fast, which is a straight-line application of force. Fast in the way that water is fast when it finds a crack. Fast in the way that something small and light moves when it is not trying to overpower you, but is trying to get past you, around you, through you, before you can adjust. His hands were bound behind his back. This should have made him helpless. It did not. In the fraction of a second before anyone could react, Ethan dropped his weight, rolled forward, and drove his shoulder into the knee joint of the soldier standing closest to Corvan. Kaylori knee joints bend forward, unlike human knees, and the impact point was precisely chosen, hitting the soft cartilage gap between the upper and lower leg plates where the armor did not cover. The soldier buckled, not from damage, but from surprise, and the disruption of balance. In the moment the soldier stumbled sideways, Ethan was already past him, already moving toward Corvan and Tessa. Corvan reacted. She was a veteran. She shifted the blade, pulled the child tighter against her. But Ethan was not attacking the way a Kaylori would attack. He was not coming at her front. He was low, beneath her sightline, moving with a speed that the heavy gravity of Kalon Prime should have made impossible for a human frame. Except Ethan had been living in that gravity for 6 years. His muscles, his tendons, his bones had been slowly, silently adapting, every morning carrying those 90-kilogram irrigation tanks, every day working with tools not built for him, every night sleeping in a world that pressed down on him 40% harder than the one he was designed for. He had been training without knowing it, or perhaps, I thought later, he had known exactly what he was doing. He hit Corvan's blade arm at the wrist, not with force, with precision. He struck the nerve cluster between the second and third wrist plates, the spot where Kaylori scales are thinnest, the spot that I had once mentioned to him offhandedly during a conversation about Kaylori anatomy. A conversation I had forgotten, a detail he had filed away and kept, as humans do, in that vast, quiet library of information they accumulate without seeming to try. Corvan's grip released. Involuntary. The blade dropped. In the same motion, Ethan grabbed Tessa, still with his arms bound behind him. He scooped the child with his body, curling around her, and shoved her toward the sleeping chamber door. "Run," he said. His voice was still flat, still empty of warmth. "Run, and do not stop." Tessa ran. Corvan struck him. A full-force backhand across the face with an armored fist. Ethan's head snapped sideways and blood sprayed from a cut that opened from his cheekbone to his jaw. He staggered, but did not fall. He turned back to face her, and his expression had not changed. The room exploded into motion. All 8 soldiers converged on him. He should have been overwhelmed in seconds. He was one human against 8 Kaylori warriors, each of them outweighing him by at least 200 pounds, each of them armed, each of them trained in combat forms that he had no knowledge of and no defense against. He fought anyway, and the way he fought broke every model the Kaylori had ever built about human capability. He did not fight like a Kaylori. He did not meet force with force. He could not, and he knew it. He fought like something else entirely, something that the Kaylori military's tactical databases had no classification for. He fought like a creature that had evolved on a death world, a planet of earthquakes and floods and predators and ice ages, a planet that had spent 4 billion years trying to destroy every living thing on its surface, and had instead produced a species that refused to stop. He used the compound. The corridors of a Kaylori home are designed for Kaylori bodies, wide enough for 4-armed passage, but with doorways and corners built for a specific width and height. Ethan was smaller. He could move through spaces the soldiers could not follow through at full speed. He ducked under arm swings that would have connected with a Kaylori opponent. He rolled through gaps between bodies that a larger being could not have fit through. He turned every architectural feature of our home into a tactical advantage, using the layout he had lived in for 6 years, every corner memorized, every distance calibrated. He used the garden, the tools he had left near the back entrance. I realized, in a moment of sickening clarity, that they were not there by accident. The pruning blade, the soil compactor, the heavy planting stakes. He had been repositioning them for weeks, since the night he had reinforced the garden walls, since the night he had told me the soil needed wind protection. He had been preparing, quietly, without telling me. Without frightening me, he had seen the threat I had dismissed, and he had made his preparations with the same patient, silent efficiency with which he did everything else. He grabbed the pruning blade with his still-bound hands, contorting his body to reach it from behind his back, and used it to cut the magnetic restraints. The moment his hands were free, everything changed. He was still outmatched, still outnumbered, still fragile compared to every opponent in that room, but he was no longer helpless. And the difference between helpless and outmatched is, I now understand, the difference between a victim and a threat. He did not try to harm them. He tried to disable them. He targeted joints, nerve clusters, the specific anatomical vulnerabilities that Kalori armor does not cover, because Kalori armor is designed to protect against Kalori attacks, not against something small and fast that attacks from angles Kalori combat training does not account for. He used the fertilizer compounds from his garden supplies, chemical mixtures designed to break down mineral deposits in Kalori soil, and when those compounds made contact with Kalori scales, they produced a burning reaction that was not dangerous, but was intensely painful and disorienting. He took damage, terrible damage. A Kalori fist connected with his ribs, and I heard the sound of bone cracking even from across the room. A blade opened his shoulder to the bone. He was struck in the back with enough force to send him into a wall. Each impact should have ended the fight. Each impact would have ended the fight against any Kalori opponent. Ethan did not stop. He absorbed each blow, adjusted, and continued. He fought in silence. That was the part that unnerved the soldiers most. Kalori warriors roar in combat. It is reflexive, biological, a product of our predator heritage. Ethan made no sound. He fought with a focused, mechanical efficiency that was more disturbing than any battle cry. He had done the math, I realized. Somewhere behind those flat, empty eyes, he had calculated the odds, calculated the cost, and decided that dying was an acceptable outcome as long as Tessa was clear and I was alive. He was not fighting to win. He was fighting to buy time. 3 soldiers went down. Not dead, disabled, dislocated joints, chemically burned scales, one with a knee that would not bear weight after Ethan drove the soil compactor into the gap behind the kneecap, with a precision that spoke of careful anatomical study. The remaining 5 regrouped. They were shaken, and I could see it in their body language, in the way they circled instead of charged, in the way they looked at each other for confirmation before moving. They were not frightened of him. Not yet. They were confused. Their training told them this fight should have been over in seconds. Their training had no model for what was happening. Korvan screamed at him. Why do you not fall? You are broken. Your bones are broken. You are bleeding. You should be on the ground. Why do you not fall? Ethan was leaning against the courtyard wall. His left arm hung at a wrong angle. Blood soaked through his shirt from the shoulder wound. He was breathing in short, sharp gasps that told me at least 2 ribs had punctured something they should not have punctured. He could barely stand. He could barely see through the swelling and the blood, but he was standing. He was upright, and the pruning blade was still in his hand. Because my wife is behind me, he said. His voice was raw, wrecked, but steady. Because there is a child behind me. You would have to end me, and even then, I would find a way. I understood then. I understood with a clarity that burned through me like plasma fire and rewrote everything I thought I knew about strength and weakness and what it means to fight. Humans are not the strongest species in the galaxy. They are not the fastest. They are not the most armored or the most technologically advanced or the most strategically brilliant, but they are the species that does not stop. Their persistence is not bravery. It is not stubbornness. It is biology. It is evolution. It is the product of a world that spent millions of years killing everything that gave up, until the only things left were the creatures that did not know how to quit. Human endurance is not a choice. It is a heritage. It is written into their cells, their muscles, their bones, their blood. They will keep going past every reasonable limit, past every rational calculation of risk and reward, past every point where any other species would surrender, or flee, or accept the inevitable. And they will do it most fiercely, most relentlessly, most terrifyingly, when they are fighting not for themselves but for someone they love. The compound security grid came back online. Alarms began to sound, loud and sharp, cutting through the night. The grid had been disabled by an electromagnetic pulse device, standard ascendancy equipment, designed to knock out civilian security systems permanently. Except our grid had not been knocked out permanently. Because Ethan had installed a manual restart mechanism 3 weeks ago. He had spliced it into the backup power supply himself, using techniques he had adapted from his agricultural irrigation systems. He had set it on a timed delay. He had anticipated the attack. He had anticipated the EMP. He had prepared a countermeasure that the Ascendancy's intelligence had not accounted for, because they had never bothered to consider what a human agricultural engineer might be capable of. The alarms brought the neighbors, Vorath and 6 other retired veterans, armored and armed, responding to what they assumed was a security malfunction and discovering instead a nightmare. They breached the compound expecting a technical fault. They found 6 Kalori soldiers on the ground and a human standing in the courtyard covered in blood. By the time the reinforcements secured the compound, Ethan had accounted for 6 of the 8 attackers himself. 6 elite Kalori soldiers, disabled by 1 human, who weighed less than any of them, and had never received a single day of military training. The last thing that happened before the situation was fully controlled was the moment that would end up in the classified report. The moment that would be analyzed by military psychologists and intelligence specialists, and would ultimately be assigned the highest threat classification in Kalori history. Corvan stood in the courtyard facing Ethan. She was the last one standing. Aside from 1 soldier behind her, she was armed. She was unhurt. She was a warrior who had defeated 60 opponents in close combat over a career spanning 3 decades. Ethan was standing between her and the door behind which he had pushed Tessa. He could barely stand. He could barely breathe. His arm was broken. His ribs were shattered. His shoulder was laid open. He was swaying on his feet, held upright by nothing visible, by no mechanism that Kalori science could explain. He raised the pruning blade. It trembled in his hand. His grip was weakening. His body was failing. Everything biological, everything mechanical, everything measurable, said he should have been unconscious, or worse by now. He was not unconscious. He was standing. He was between her and the door, and his eyes, through the blood and the swelling, were still flat, still focused, still communicating the same simple, terrible message. You will have to go through me, and I am not finished. Corvan looked at him. She looked at the pruning blade shaking in his hand. She looked at the 6 soldiers on the ground around him, and Corvan, a warrior who had never retreated from anything in her life, took 1 step backward. Not because he was strong, not because she was afraid of him physically, because she was looking at something her training had no protocol for. A creature that loved something more than it feared death. A creature that could not be calculated, could not be predicted, could not be stopped by any force short of absolute destruction. And in that calculus, in that cold warrior's mathematics, she found something she had never encountered in 30 years of combat. Uncertainty. The veterans reached them seconds later. Corvan surrendered without resistance, but she never took her eyes off Ethan, and when the restraints were placed on her wrists, she said something that would later be quoted in the classified report, something that the Kalori High Council would read in silence and then lock away in the highest security archive they possessed. We have been measuring the wrong things, she said. Strength, speed, armor, none of it matters. The human has something we did not account for, something we cannot counter. He has something to lose. Ethan spent 11 days in a medical pod. I did not leave his side. I did not eat regular meals. I did not sleep in proper cycles. I sat in a chair beside the transparent casing and watched the machines repair him, piece by piece, bone by bone, and I thought about every single moment of our life together that I had misunderstood. The medical report was extensive. A broken left arm, 3 fractures, 4 broken ribs, 2 of which had caused a partial lung collapse. A deep laceration across the right shoulder that had damaged the muscle tissue beneath. Contusions, abrasions, and soft tissue damage across 60% of his body. Minor internal organ damage from blunt force trauma. The attending physician, a Kalori specialist who had treated combat casualties for 40 years, told me that by every medical standard, Ethan should have lost consciousness after the 2nd or 3rd major blow. The fact that he remained functional, remained standing, remained fighting through that level of accumulated damage was, in her professional opinion, physiologically extraordinary and deeply concerning. Deeply concerning, I almost laughed. The most dangerous man on Kalon Prime, and the medical profession's response was that he was concerning. He woke on the fourth day, his eyes opened slowly, clouded with medication and residual pain, and the first thing he did was look around the room. Not at me, not at the medical equipment. He looked for the door. He assessed the exits. Even drugged, even broken, some part of him was still calculating threats and escape routes. Then his gaze found me, and everything else drained away, and he was just Ethan again. My Ethan. The man who grew tomatoes and hummed while he cooked. "Is the kid okay?" he said. Not, "Am I alive?" Not, "Did we win?" Not, "What happened?" His first words, his first conscious thought after 11 days of medically induced repair, were about an 8-year-old Kalori girl, who was not his child, not his species, not his responsibility by any cultural or legal standard. I broke. For the first time in my adult life, I wept. I wept in front of the medical staff, in front of the security personnel stationed outside the door, in front of anyone who happened to be watching. I did not care. I had spent 6 years being ashamed of my husband's softness, and I now understood with a clarity that felt like being hit by a star that his softness and his ferocity were the same thing. They were not opposites. They were two faces of the same quality. The same man who talked to his plants, and could not open a jar, and smiled at everyone he met, was the same man who stood between 8 armed soldiers and a child, and refused to fall. The kindness was the courage. The gentleness was the strength. They were never separate. I had just been too blind, too trapped in my own culture's definitions to see it. I told him everything I should have said years ago. I told him I was sorry. Sorry for every moment I had felt ashamed. Sorry for the times I had looked at him through my people's eyes instead of my own. Sorry for ever thinking, even for a second, that choosing him was choosing weakness. I told him that he was the strongest person I had ever known, and that I had fought beside warriors who could shatter mountains, and none of them, not one, had ever made me feel as safe as he did. Ethan listened. He held my hand with his unbroken one, and when I finished, he squeezed my fingers gently and said, "Vale, I never needed you to see me as strong. I just needed you to let me love you." I held his hand and cried harder. Outside the medical facility, Kalon Prime was shifting. The security footage from our compound had been released to the public networks. I do not know who released it. I suspect it was Draven. My cousin had access to the military intelligence channels through which the footage had been filed, and he had the rank to circumvent the classification protocols. I have never asked him directly, and he has never volunteered the information, but the footage appeared on every major Kalori network within 48 hours of the incident, and it spread across the galactic communication networks within a week. The galaxy watched a single human, unarmed, untrained, and physically outmatched in every measurable way, stand between 8 elite Kalori warriors and a child. They watched him take damage that should have dropped him 3 times over, and continue fighting. They watched him refuse to fall. They watched the look on Korvan's face when she stepped backward. The Kalori public reacted in a way that no political analyst had predicted. This is a warrior culture. A civilization built on the foundation that strength is the ability to destroy. That power is measured in combat capability. That the highest virtue is the capacity to end threats through superior force. They should have dismissed Ethan. By their own metrics, he lost the fight. He did not overpower anyone. He did not display superior combat technique. He did not demonstrate the kind of decisive, overwhelming force that Kalori culture celebrates. But that is not what they saw. What they saw was something their culture had no framework for and no defense against. They saw a human fight for love, not for glory, not for honor, not for territory or status or species pride. For love, for a wife who was not his species, for a child who was not his own. He fought without rage, without war cries, without the theatrical displays of dominance that define Kalori combat culture. He fought in silence, with a focused, relentless, mechanically purposeful determination that was more unsettling than any show of force. And when he was broken, when his bones were broken, and his body was failing, and every rational assessment said he should stop, he did not stop. This, it turned out, was the thing the Kalori could not dismiss. Not the fighting, the not stopping, because the Kalori, for all their martial pride, understand limits. They understand the point at which damage exceeds function, the point at which a warrior falls because biology demands it, the point at which continuing is not brave but simply impossible. They have never encountered a species for whom that point is negotiable. A species that can look at the impossible and say, "Not yet." Tessa's parents, Vorath and his mate, came to the medical facility on the 6th day. They came in formal ceremonial dress. They came with witnesses. They came to perform a ritual that I, in 30 years of military service, had only seen performed twice, both times for Kaylori warriors of exceptional distinction. They granted Ethan the title of shield-bearer. In Kaylori tradition, a shield-bearer is one who places their body between danger and the young. It is not a combat title. It is older than that, older than the military itself, reaching back to the earliest days of Kaylori civilization, when protection of children was considered the highest duty any adult could perform. It has never, in the entire recorded history of our species, been granted to a non-Kaylori. Ethan, still in the medical pod, still bandaged and medicated and barely able to sit up, listened to the ceremony with quiet attention. When Vorath placed the shield-bearer's mark on the casing of the medical pod, a carved stone symbol that would later be permanently mounted above the entrance to our compound, Ethan said, "Thank you. But she's a brave kid. She would have been fine." Vorath, a warrior who had been decorated for valor in 4 campaigns, looked at this small, broken human and shook his head slowly. "She would not have been fine," he said, "and we both know it. What you did, I could not have done. Not because I lack the ability, but because I would have calculated the odds first. You did not calculate, you simply moved. That is something I do not understand, and I do not need to understand it. I only need to respect it." Draven came on the 8th day. He arrived alone, without ceremony, without announcement. He stood in the doorway of the medical room for a long time without speaking. I watched him. I watched him look at Ethan, at the bandages, at the medical readouts displaying the slow progress of bone and tissue repair. Draven, who had mocked Ethan's grip strength. Draven, who had questioned whether I kept him as a comfort companion. Draven, who represented everything the Kaylori valued and everything they used to measure worth. Draven walked to the medical pod. He removed something from beneath his armor. A campaign medal, his personal campaign medal, awarded for actions during the Battle of the Vaith Corridor, the single most decorated engagement of his career. He placed it on the blanket covering Ethan's legs. He stood there for 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked out without a word. Ethan looked at the medal. He looked at me. "What is this?" he asked. "It is the highest thing he has," I said, "and he just gave it to you." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Can you make sure he gets it back? I think it means more to him than it would to me. And I don't need a medal, Vale. I just need to know everyone is safe." The Kaylori High Council formally condemned the Vaynar ascendancy 2 weeks after the incident. The political movement that I had dismissed as fringe, that every established institution had dismissed as fringe, was declared a threat to planetary security and subjected to a comprehensive investigation that would ultimately result in the arrest of over 300 members, including 17 serving military officers. More quietly, behind closed doors, the council commissioned something else. A classified study on what the human military researchers who were brought in as consultants called protective aggression response. The study took 4 months. It involved interviews with human psychologists, neurologists, evolutionary biologists, and military combat specialists. It produced a report of over 600 pages. The report was given the highest threat classification the Kaylori intelligence apparatus has ever assigned. Not because humans are dangerous in the conventional sense. The Kaylori military could defeat a human military force through sheer physical and technological superiority. The report was classified because of what it revealed about unpredictability. The Kaylori can model every species they have encountered. They can calculate threat levels. They can predict behavior under stress. They can determine, with mathematical precision, the point at which any given species will break, retreat, or surrender. They cannot do this with humans, because the variable that determines human combat performance is not strength, not training, not technology, not numbers. It is emotional attachment. A human will exceed every physiological limit, every rational calculation, every predictive model, if they believe that someone they love is in danger. And emotional attachment cannot be measured. It cannot be predicted. It cannot be countered by any tactical doctrine. The report concluded with a single recommendation, which I have been told was underlined 3 times by the senior analyst who wrote it. Do not threaten what a human loves. There is no model for what happens next. Three weeks after the incident, Ethan was healed enough to move slowly. I offered to help him to the garden. He declined. He wanted to walk on his own, he said, even if it took him 3 times as long. I watched from the balcony as he made his way outside, one careful step at a time, favoring his left side, where the ribs were still tender, and settled himself on the low stone wall beside his planting beds. The garden had been damaged in the fighting. Planting beds were overturned. The irrigation system he had so carefully built was partially destroyed. Several of his earth plants, the ones he had spent years coaxing to grow in alien soil, were crushed or uprooted. He surveyed the damage with a quiet, steady gaze. Then he reached down, picked up a fallen seedling, and began to replant it. Tessa appeared 20 minutes later. She climbed over the compound wall in the same spot she had been using for her secret nighttime visits, dropped into the garden with the casual confidence of an 8-year-old who considers a 12-foot wall a minor inconvenience, and sat down beside Ethan without a word. She picked up a seedling and began helping. They worked together in silence for a while. Then Ethan said something to her, too quiet for me to hear from the balcony, and she laughed. It was the first time I had heard her laugh since the night of the attack. Over the following days, other children began to appear, Kaylori children from the surrounding compounds, drawn by the quiet human who grew things and told stories and never raised his voice. They came in 1s and 2s at first, shy and curious, peeking over the wall before committing to entry. Ethan welcomed each one without fuss. He gave them small tasks. He taught them the names of earth plants. He told them stories about a blue planet far away, where the rain was made of water, and the sky changed color 4 times a day. The neighborhood veterans watched. They watched from their balconies, just as they had before, but their expressions had changed. The pity was gone. The confusion was gone. In its place was something quieter and more complicated. Something that, if I had to name it, I would call recognition. They were seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a human, not as an alien, not as a curiosity or a scandal, or a political symbol, as a man who had nearly died protecting what he loved, and who, the moment he could stand again, went back to growing things. The courtyard wall was rebuilt by the Neighborhood Veterans Council. They did not ask permission. They arrived one morning with construction materials and reinforced it to military specification. When Ethan asked why, Vorath said, "Because the children come here, and anything that protects the children is worth building properly." I stood on the balcony and watched my husband plant seeds in alien soil, while Kaylori children sat around him and listened to stories about rain. And I thought about everything I had believed, and everything I had learned, and everything that had changed in the space of one terrible night. The Kaylori have a saying, "Strength is the ability to destroy." We built our entire civilization on that principle. We conquered star systems. We defeated every enemy. We measured every being we encountered by how much damage they could inflict, and we judged them accordingly. We looked at humans and saw something small and soft and fragile, something that did not meet our criteria, something that could be dismissed. And then a human gardener walked into our world. He knelt in the dirt. He grew tomatoes in soil that should not have supported them. He learned our language without being asked. He adapted to our gravity without complaining. He memorized our anatomy out of quiet curiosity. He reinforced our walls without telling anyone why. He held a frightened child's hands and told her she would be fine. And when the darkness came, when armed soldiers stood in his home and threatened everything he loved, he stood up, and he did not stop standing until every single one of them was on the ground. Not because he was strong, because he loved us. My husband is kind. My husband is gentle. He grows vegetables and hums while he cooks and talks to his plants, and cannot open a Kaylori jar without asking for help. He reads bedtime stories to neighborhood children who are not his species. He makes soup when the neighbors are sick. He fixed the irrigation system for the entire district last summer and refused payment because he said neighbors do not charge neighbors. 3 galactic intelligence agencies have classified him as a strategic-level threat. The Kalori High Council has a 600-page report on what he is capable of, locked in their highest security archive. Military training programs across 4 star systems have been revised to account for what they now call the human protection variable. My husband does not know about any of this. If he did, he would probably laugh, and then he would ask if anyone wanted tomatoes. Because the new batch is coming in nicely, and he always grows more than we can eat. He is the most dangerous being on this planet, and the most gentle. And they are the same thing. They have always been the same thing. I was simply too blind to see it. My name is Valith Sauron. I am a Kalori fleet commander, retired. I have fought in 11 campaigns. I have faced enemies that would freeze the blood of most species in this galaxy. And I am so very proud to be his wife.